The red wine dripped from my cream dress like a fresh wound, staining the only expensive thing I owned. My son screamed that I was being selfish, while his wife sneered, thinking I was just a helpless widow they could humiliate for sport. They had no idea that by ruining my dress, they had just signed their own financial death warrants. I calmly wiped my phone screen and texted my lawyer 3 simple words: "It is time." My name is Eleanor Briggs. I am 68 years old, a widow of sturdy Irish stock, and I have spent the last 40 years of my life in the working-class neighbourhoods of Riverton, a city that feels more like a rusted machine than a home these days. Tonight, however, I stood under the crystal chandeliers of the Hartwell Ridge estate, feeling less like a guest and more like an uninvited stain on a pristine silk tablecloth. This was the rehearsal dinner for my son, Daniel, and his fiancée, Olivia Hart. The air smelled of expensive perfume, roasted duck, and old money, a sharp contrast to the scent of lavender detergent and dust that usually clung to my clothes. I smoothed the skirt of my cream-coloured dress. I had saved for 6 months to buy it, putting away $20 here and $50 there, skipping lunches and mending my own socks, just hoping to look presentable enough to not embarrass Daniel. But here, surrounded by women in designer gowns that cost more than my car, I felt invisible. The room was a symphony of excess: gold-rimmed plates, waiters in tuxedos, and laughter that sounded like breaking glass. I stood near the edge of the room, clutching my purse, trying to make myself as small as possible. The tension had been simmering all evening, but it finally boiled over near the dessert table. Olivia cornered me, her face flushed with champagne and entitlement. She was beautiful, in a sharp, predatory way, and she brought up the house again. That small, drafty bungalow George and I had bought 40 years ago, the one where Daniel took his first steps. "You are being selfish, Eleanor," Olivia hissed, her voice low but carrying that sharp edge she reserved just for me. "We need that liquidity for the final vendor payments. If you sold that rundown shack, we could actually afford the reception Daniel deserves. You are holding him back." I looked at my son, hoping he would step in, hoping he would remember the nights I worked double shifts to pay for his private school tuition, or the way I wore the same winter coat for 10 years so he could have new cleats. Instead, Daniel swirled his drink and refused to meet my eyes. "Mum, please," he muttered, his voice thick with irritation. "Just listen to her. You are ruining the most important day of my life over a pile of rotting bricks." I shook my head gently. "That house is not just bricks, Daniel. It is my home, and it was your father's legacy." That was when Olivia snapped. Her hand jerked forward in a violent arc, and a wave of dark red liquid splashed across my chest. The cold shock of the wine soaked through my dress instantly, clinging to my skin like blood. The sound of the glass hitting the floor shattered the polite hum of conversation. Time seemed to freeze. I could feel the cold wine dripping down my stomach. I saw a waiter freeze mid-step with a silver tray of canapés. I saw the videographer, who had been capturing candid moments for the wedding video, lower his camera slightly, the red recording light still blinking like an unblinking eye. He had caught it all. The humiliation was total. A physical weight pressing down on my shoulders, turning the cream fabric of my dress into a map of my shame. "If you do not drop this selfish poverty act, do not bother coming to the wedding." Olivia spat, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. I looked at Daniel. He was not looking at his wife with horror. He was not rushing to help me. He was looking at me with annoyance. "Do not make a big scene. Mom," he whispered, leaning in close so only I could hear the dagger in his words. "You always make everything revolve around you." That sentence hurt more than the wine. It pierced through the years of sacrifice, through the lonely nights, through every dollar I had scraped together for him. Something inside me, a quiet latch that had held back years of resentment, finally clicked open. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply reached into my damp clutch and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady as I wiped a drop of Merlot from the screen. I opened my messages and scrolled down to a conversation that had been dormant for months. The contact name was Marcus Doyle. His last message to me read, "When you decide you are done enduring, just text me." I typed 3 words, "It is time." I pressed send. I put the phone back in my purse and looked at my son and his wife one last time. I did not offer them an apology. I did not offer them a defense. I simply turned around and walked away. As I made my way out of the ballroom, the whispers started. I could hear the word selfish floating in the air, mixed with snickers about my ruined dress. I kept my chin up, walking past the mahogany bar near the exit. A man was sitting there, nursing a scotch. He had silver hair and wore a black suit that looked like it cost more than my entire mortgage. As I passed, he turned. His eyes locked onto mine. There was no pity in his gaze, only a flash of intense recognition, as if he were seeing a ghost from a lifetime ago. I did not stop to figure out who he was. I pushed through the heavy double doors and walked out into the cool night air, leaving the warmth and the cruelty behind me. They thought they had broken me. They did not know they had just released me. I spent 40 years of my life balancing ledgers at the West Alderidge Adult Learning Center. I was precise. I was reliable. And I was invisible. That was how I lived my life. And that was how I raised my son. My husband, George, was a union electrician who smelled of copper wire and honest sweat. We lived a simple life in a small, drafty bungalow in the working-class district of Riverton. We did not have trust funds or summer homes. We had a savings jar on top of the refrigerator and a mortgage we chipped away at month by month. When George died of a massive stroke 10 years ago, my world shrank. I took on extra work doing the bookkeeping for a local grocery store in the evenings, just to keep up with the tuition for the private university Daniel insisted on attending. I wore shoes until the soles wore through and patched my winter coats so that Daniel could have the fraternity dues and the spring break trips he said were essential for his networking. I loved him with a quiet, fierce dedication. The kind that does not ask for thanks because it assumes the bond between mother and son is payment enough. George left me the house and one other thing, a strange, almost forgotten investment. Years ago, he had given $5,000 of our savings to an old drinking buddy who was starting a small construction business. I had been furious at the time, worried about the bills, but George just laughed and said it was a seed for the future. That small company eventually morphed into Crown Line Developments, the massive real estate conglomerate owned by the Hart family. I never paid it much mind, thinking the shares had likely been diluted to nothing over the decades. Just a piece of paper in a dusty box under the bed. Daniel was a good boy once. I remember him at 10 years old, holding my hand at a funeral for my aunt, promising me that he would never let anyone make me cry. But the higher he climbed the social ladder, the more I became an anchor dragging him down. When he met Olivia Hart, everything changed. He started correcting my grammar. He stopped inviting me to meet his friends. He started looking at our little house not as a home, but as an eyesore. I will never forget the first time I met Olivia. She sat on my worn floral sofa, looking around with a tight, polite smile that did not reach her eyes. She called my porcelain figurine collection cute. It was not a compliment. It was the way one talks to a child or a pet. She treated me like a prop, a background character in the movie of her fabulous life. The divide between us was not just money. It was a language I could not speak. The Harts talked about yacht maintenance and boarding schools. I worried about the rising cost of heating oil and whether my social security check would clear on time. Slowly, systematically, Olivia and her mother, Veronica, began to curate my presence in Daniel's life. At the engagement party, they sat me at a table near the kitchen doors, claiming it was quieter there so I would not be overwhelmed by the music. When the photographer came around for family portraits, Veronica gently guided me out of the frame, smiling sweetly and saying they wanted just the core couple for the press release. I swallowed every insult. I told myself that as long as Daniel was happy, my pride did not matter. I thought silence was a form of love. I did not realize that by staying silent, I was teaching my son that his mother was disposable. I was teaching him that disrespect was acceptable as long as it was wrapped in silk and delivered with a smile. The night before the rehearsal dinner, I sat alone in my living room, mending a loose thread on the hem of the cream dress I had bought on clearance. The house was quiet, filled with the ghosts of memories. I pricked my finger with the needle, and a tiny bead of blood welled up. I sucked on it, tasting the iron. And suddenly I heard George's voice in my head, clear as a bell. He used to tell me, "Eleanor, do not let anyone push you away from your own dinner table." I had spent years letting them push me away, inch by inch, until I was standing on the precipice of total erasure. I tied off the thread and bit it loose. I did not know it then, sitting in the dim light of my fading home. But that night was the last time I would sew up a wound without fighting back. The next time they tried to cut me, I decided I would not be the one bleeding. I stood in the gravel parking lot, the night air biting into my damp skin. The wine had begun to dry, turning sticky and cold against my chest, a physical reminder of the humiliation I had just fled. I was fumbling for my car keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice, when a deep voice cut through the darkness. "Ellie." I froze. No one had called me that in 50 years. To Daniel, I was Mom. To the neighbours, I was Mrs. Briggs. To the Harts, I was an inconvenience. Ellie was a name from another life, a life before mortgages and widowhood and the slow erosion of my dignity. I turned around. The man in the black suit was standing a few feet away, illuminated by the amber glow of a street lamp. Up close, the lines on his face were deeper, and his hair was the colour of polished steel. But I knew him. My eyes found the small, jagged white scar just above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a bicycle accident when we were 16. Suddenly, the smell of old paper and dust filled my nose, the sensory memory of the town library where we used to hide in the back stacks, reading poetry to each other until the librarian chased us out. "Lawrence," I whispered, the name feeling strange and heavy on my tongue. Lawrence Kane. My first love. The boy who had promised to take me to Paris, who had sworn we would escape our small, suffocating town together. But then he had gone away to college, and the letters never came. and I had married George, a good man who offered stability when my heart felt like a hollowed-out ruin. He stepped closer, his expensive shoes crunching softly on the gravel. "I thought I was seeing things when you walked past the bar," he said, his voice low and steady, possessing a gravitational pull I had not felt in decades. "But then I saw your eyes. You still have the same eyes. Ellie." I tried to pull my shawl tighter to hide the wine stain, suddenly acutely aware of how pathetic I must look. An old woman, stained and trembling, standing in the shadow of a mansion where she was not wanted. "What are you doing here, Lawrence?" I asked, my voice cracking. "I am a strategic partner for Crown Line Developments," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the lit windows of the estate behind us. "My firm, Kane Row Holdings, has been buying up their debt. I was inside. I saw what happened. Ellie." I looked away, shame heating my cheeks. "Then you saw a foolish old woman get put in her place?" "No," he said sharply. "I saw a room full of vultures tearing at the woman who gave them everything. Is that truly how they treat the person who holds their legacy in her hands?" I frowned, confused. "Legacy, Lawrence? I have nothing. Just a drafty house and a checking account that barely covers the heating bill." He did not answer immediately. Instead, he took off his suit jacket. It was heavy wool, lined with silk, and still held the warmth of his body. He draped it over my shoulders, covering the red stain, covering the shivering. It was a simple gesture, but after the icy indifference of my son and the cruelty of his wife, the weight of that coat felt like an embrace. "There is something you do not know," he said softly. "When I left for university, I wrote to you. Every week for 2 years. I sent them to your house." My breath hitched. "I never received a single one. I thought you had forgotten me." "Your mother," he said, a sad smile touching his lips. "She intercepted them. She told me you had moved on, that you were happy with George. She thought I was too dreamy, too unstable for her Ellie. She made the choice for us." The revelation hit me harder than the wine had. All those years, I had believed I was not enough to be remembered. I had built my life on the foundation of that rejection. I had let myself be small because I thought I wasn't worth being big. "It is a cruel irony, isn't it?" Lawrence continued, looking toward the mansion where the party was still raging. "First your mother took your voice away in love. Now your son tries to take your voice away in life. They all seem to think they know what is best for Eleanor Briggs." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black car key, but he did not move to leave. He looked me dead in the eye, the same intense gaze that had once made my teenage knees weak. "I saw you text someone. Ellie," he said. "And I saw the look on your face. You sent the signal." I gripped the lapels of his coat, feeling the fine fabric under my rough fingertips. "I did." "Good," Lawrence said, "because I suspect you are not just asking for an apology. You are holding a trump card. Ellie, a financial trigger buried so deep in the paperwork that even the hearts do not know it exists. But I do, and I think it is time you found out exactly what you are worth." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time that night, the cold left my bones. I was not just the poor widow in the parking lot anymore. I was Ellie, and I had a partner. "Take me to my car, Lawrence," I said, my voice steadying. "I have a meeting with a lawyer in the morning." He offered me his arm, courtly and respectful. as if I were a queen and not a stained outcast. And as we walked toward my rusted sedan, I realized that while the Harts had thrown wine, Lawrence Kane had just handed me the match to light the fuse. The offices of Doyle and Sanderson Law Group were located on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Riverton, a place I usually visited only to sign tax forms or update simple beneficiary details. I had always felt small here, sitting in the plush leather chair across from Marcus Doyle, clutching my handbag as if I were wasting his billable hours. But today, sitting next to Lawrence Kane, the room felt different. The air conditioning hummed with a quiet intensity. And for the first time, Marcus was not looking at me with the patient smile one offers a confused grandmother. He was looking at me with the sharpness of a shark smelling blood in the water. Marcus slid a thick file folder across the mahogany desk. It was yellowed at the edges, smelling of old archive boxes. Eleanor, do you remember when George invested in that small construction firm back in 1982? Marcus asked. I nodded slowly. It was $5,000, a fortune for us at the time. I always thought it was just money thrown into a hole. It was, in a way, Marcus said, opening the file to a page covered in dense legal text. Over the decades, as Crown Line developments grew and went through multiple rounds of funding, your financial stake was diluted. In terms of cash value, your shares are not worth a fortune. Maybe enough for a new car, but not a life-changing amount. However, George did something very smart. Or perhaps he was just stubborn. He insisted on a founding shareholder protection clause. I frowned, trying to pass the legalese. What does that mean? Marcus. It means that while your financial slice of the pie got smaller, your voice at the table did not, Marcus explained, tapping a specific paragraph. Specifically regarding the disposition or leveraging of core assets. The clause states that any attempt to mortgage, sell, or significantly restructure the primary assets of the company requires the unanimous consent of the original founding shareholders, or their heirs. He paused to let that sink in. Eleanor, you are the sole heir to George Briggs. Lawrence leaned forward then, his voice calm but laced with iron. Crown Line is currently in a liquidity crisis. Ellie, they have overextended themselves building the new marina to stay afloat and to pay for that ridiculous wedding. They are trying to secure a massive new loan. The bank has agreed, but there is a catch. They need to put up their headquarters, the Hartwell Tower, as collateral. Marcus nodded. And because of this clause, they cannot mortgage Hartwell Tower without your signature. Legally, you have veto power over the entire transaction. If you say no, the loan falls through. If the loan falls through, they default on their operational costs within 30 days. I sat back, the leather of the chair creaking under my weight. My heart hammered against my ribs. For years, Olivia and Daniel had treated me like a financial burden, a woman who needed to be managed and minimized. They had thrown wine on me because I refused to sell a bungalow worth maybe $200,000, all while I held the key to a deal worth tens of millions. The absurdity of it made me want to laugh, but the lump in my throat was too large. So? I said, my voice trembling slightly. They threw me out of the party, but they need me to save the company. They do not even know they need you. Lawrence added. That is the beauty of it. They assume George's shares were washed out years ago. They have no idea you are the gatekeeper. And there is one more thing. My firm, Kane Rowe Holdings, just purchased the majority of Crown Line's existing corporate bonds. If they cannot get this new loan to restructure, they default on the payments they owe me. Lawrence looked at me, his eyes dark and serious. I hold the debt. Ellie, you hold the permission slip. We are standing at both ends of the bridge, and we have the power to burn it down while they are still standing in the middle. The room fell silent. I looked at the papers, seeing not just legal terms, but the faces of my son and his wife. I saw the way Daniel looked at the floor when Olivia insulted me. I felt the cold splash of wine on my chest. So, Marcus said softly, the question is yours to answer. Eleanor, what do you want to do? We can block the loan and watch them file for bankruptcy. We can sell your rights for a lump sum and walk away, or we can negotiate. For the first time in my life, someone was asking me what I wanted, not what was best for Daniel, not what would keep the peace, but what I wanted. I thought about the money. It would be nice to be rich, to never worry about a heating bill again. But money would not fix the hole in my chest where my son's respect used to be. If I just took cash, they would hate me. But they would still look down on me. They would think I was just a greedy old woman who got lucky. I do not want their money, I said, my voice hardening. I want them to understand. I want them to know exactly what it feels like to be powerless. I want Daniel to remember that the woman he was ashamed of is the only thing standing between him and ruin. I want to teach them a lesson they cannot buy their way out of. Marcus smiled, a thin, sharp expression. I thought you might say that. I want to offer them a deal, I continued. I will sign the papers. I will save their precious tower and their company, but it comes with conditions, real conditions. Marcus pulled out a yellow legal pad. We can draft a restructuring proposal. We can demand a public apology. We can demand board oversight. We can make them bleed for every inch of ground. Lawrence placed his hand over mine on the desk. His skin was warm. But before we send the official proposal, Ellie, you need to be sure. Once we pull this trigger, there is no going back to being just Mom. I looked at the two men, my allies in this quiet war. Draft the proposal, I told Marcus, but do not send it yet. I want to give them one last chance. I want to see if my son is truly gone, or if he is just lost. I will wait for them to come to me. And when they do, we will see which side Daniel chooses. When my phone rang the next morning, the caller ID showed Daniel's name. His voice was tight, trembling with a rehearsal anxiety that I recognized immediately. He asked if we could meet for dinner at Le Ciel, the most expensive French restaurant in Riverton, to clear the air. He said he wanted to apologize. I looked at Lawrence, who was sitting at my kitchen table drinking black coffee, and we both knew the truth. This was not an apology. It was a soft ambush. I arrived at the restaurant with Lawrence by my side. When we reached the table, Daniel looked confused, his eyes darting between me and the tall, silver-haired man in the suit. I introduced Lawrence simply as an old friend from high school. Olivia was already seated, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my car. As soon as I sat down, her face transformed into a mask of sweetness. She reached across the table to touch my hand, her nails clicking against the tablecloth. Eleanor, you look wonderful, she said, her voice dripping with syrup. I feel just terrible about the other night. The wedding stress has me completely frayed. You know I would never mean to ruin your dress. It was just a silly accident. I withdrew my hand slowly. It was not an accident. Olivia. Before she could respond, a shadow fell over the table. Veronica Hart had arrived. She slid into the booth next to Daniel, smelling of gardenias and aggression. She did not waste time with menus. "We are all family here," Veronica said, signaling the waiter to bring a bottle of vintage champagne. "And families help each other during transitions. We need to make sure Crown Line is secure for Daniel and Olivia's future. To that end, our legal team realized there were some outdated administrative files regarding your late husband's assets." She pulled a thick stack of documents from her designer tote and placed them in front of me. A heavy Mont Blanc pen followed. "It is just a formality," Veronica purred. "A reallocation of assets to a holding company to streamline our tax liabilities. It actually protects you from market volatility. We just need a quick signature on the bottom of page 4 and 10. I put on my reading glasses and scanned the pages. The legal jargon was dense, intended to confuse. But thanks to Marcus, I knew exactly what I was looking at. This was not a reallocation. It was a total transfer of my veto rights to a shell company controlled by the Hart family. If I signed this, I would be stripping myself of the only weapon I had. I looked up, feigning confusion. Goodness. This is a lot of words. You know I am not good with these things. I really think I should take this to my old lawyer, Marcus, just to have him explain it to me. The air at the table instantly grew colder. Veronica's smile tightened at the corners. "There is no need for that. Eleanor," Veronica said, her voice dropping an octave. "It is standard boilerplate. Lawyers will just charge you fees to tell you what I am telling you now." I looked at Daniel. He was staring at his hands, twisting his napkin. "Mum, just sign it," he said, his voice sounding hollow. "It is for your own protection. Why do you always have to make things difficult?" I felt a sharp pang in my chest. He was parroting them. My son, the boy I had raised to be honest, was trying to trick me into signing away his father's legacy because he was too weak to stand up to his mother-in-law. I do not feel comfortable signing something I do not understand. "Daniel," I said softly. Olivia let out a sharp sigh, dropping the facade. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Eleanor, you are being selfish again. What do you even need those shares for? You do not understand business. You are holding up the entire future of this family because you want attention. Just sign the damn paper." The word selfish hung in the air between us. I slowly took off my reading glasses and folded them on the table. I looked Olivia dead in the eye. "You are being selfish," I repeated, letting the words land with the weight of a judge's gavel. I pushed the papers back toward Veronica. "I am not signing this," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Because if I sign this transfer, it invalidates the restructuring proposal that my lawyer, Marcus Doyle, and Mr. Kane's firm submitted to your board of directors this morning." Veronica froze. Her eyes snapped to Lawrence, who was sipping his water, looking bored but dangerous. "You know, Mr. Kane, do you not?" I asked, gesturing to Lawrence. "He owns the majority of your corporate debt, and I own the veto power on your new loan. We have offered you a way to save your company, Veronica. But if I sign your little trick document here, that offer is withdrawn, and you default on your loans in 72 hours. The silence that followed was absolute. I saw the colour drain from Daniel's face as he realised the magnitude of what I was saying. I saw Veronica's hand spasm around the stem of her wineglass, her knuckles turning white. Olivia opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to throw another insult, but Veronica kicked her sharply under the table. I heard the thud of the shoe against the shin and saw Olivia wince, shutting her mouth instantly. They looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. They did not see the poor widow in the old dress anymore. They saw the person holding the pen that could write the end of their story. "We are done here," I said, standing up. "You should go read the proposal Marcus sent. It has some very specific conditions. And Daniel, I suggest you read it carefully before you decide who you want to listen to." I walked out of the restaurant with Lawrence, leaving a table full of expensive food untouched and a family full of secrets unraveling. They thought they were inviting a victim to dinner. They ended up dining with the executioner. The next morning, Veronica Hart stood on my front porch. She looked like a diamond dropped into a bucket of coal. My neighborhood in Riverton is not a place where limousines idle at the curb, and her presence made the peeling paint on my railing look even more tired. She was carrying a massive basket of imported pears and orchids, and tucked into her designer clutch was an envelope that I knew contained the price of my silence. I let her in. My living room is small, filled with the furniture George and I bought 40 years ago. There are hand-crocheted lace doilies on the side tables and framed photographs of Daniel from every stage of his life covering the walls. Veronica walked in, her heels clicking sharply against my worn hardwood floors. It sounded like a hammer striking a gavel. She looked around with a thinly veiled distaste, as if she were afraid she might catch poverty if she touched the arm of my floral chair. She placed the basket on the coffee table and sat on the edge of the sofa. She did not waste time with small talk. She slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a cashier's check for $500,000. "This is for you, Eleanor," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. "We want you to be comfortable. We want you to have the retirement you deserve. All you have to do is sign the papers transferring the voting rights. It is a fair trade. Security for you, stability for us." I looked at the check. $500,000. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life. It could fix the roof. It could buy a new car. It could buy a lot of things. But as I looked at Veronica, I realized what it could not buy. "If you do not take this," Veronica said, her tone shifting from generous to ominous, "you need to understand the consequences. Crown Line will have to restructure aggressively. That means layoffs. Hundreds of families will lose their income because of your stubbornness. And Daniel, we might have to let him go. The board will look for a scapegoat. Do you really want to be the reason your son loses his career? The press will have a field day. They will dig up every sad, pathetic detail of your life and paint you as the bitter mother destroying her son's success." I listened to her threaten me in my own living room. I picked up the check. I held it up to the sunlight coming through the window, letting the watermark catch the light. Then, slowly and deliberately, I tore it in half, then in half again. I kept tearing until the check was nothing but confetti. I reached over to the mantel and picked up a lopsided ceramic bowl that Daniel had made in the 3rd grade. It was painted a muddy blue and still had his thumbprint in the clay. I dropped the pieces of the check into the bowl. "You are mistaken, Veronica," I said, my voice steady. "I am not here to save Crown Line, and I am not here to save Daniel's job. I am here to save you all from the delusion that you can treat people like garbage and pay your way out of it. You think money solves the rot in your family, but it just feeds it." Veronica stood up, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "You are making a mistake. You are going to end up alone. Eleanor, Daniel will hate you for this. When you are sick and dying in this drafty box, no one will come. You will rot here all by yourself. Is your pride worth that? I felt a chill run through me. She had found the one fear that actually kept me awake at night. The fear of dying alone. But as I looked at her, a woman who had family and money but no soul, I realized there was something worse than being alone. I am afraid of being alone, I admitted. But I would rather be alone with my self-respect than be surrounded by a family that despises me. I would rather sit in this drafty box with my dignity than sit at your table and swallow your insults. I used to think any connection was better than none. I was wrong. Veronica stared at me for a long moment, her mouth a thin line of hate. Then she turned and marched out the door, slamming it so hard the pictures on the wall rattled. I waited until the sound of her limousine faded down the street. Then I picked up the phone and called Marcus. Lawrence was on the line as well. Send the proposal, I told them. But I want the condition regarding the apology to be non-negotiable, a public admission of wrongdoing, and I want a binding commitment to the community fund. If they want the loan, they have to bend the knee. After I hung up, I walked to the back window and looked out at the garden. George had planted wildflowers there years ago, coneflowers and black-eyed Susans. The soil was poor and rocky, and I often forgot to water them. But every year, without fail, they came back. They stood tall and bright against the grey fence, demanding nothing, yet surviving everything. I pressed my hand against the cool glass. I was just like them. I did not need Veronica's water. I could bloom all on my own. Marcus Doyle sent the official proposal to the Crown Line Board of Directors at 9 o'clock sharp. It was not just a legal document, it was a mirror, forcing them to look at their own reflection. The terms were clear. I would use my veto power to approve the restructuring, and Lawrence's firm would extend the maturity date on the bonds, effectively saving the company from immediate bankruptcy. In exchange, however, the price was heavy, though not in dollars. The document demanded a public apology, delivered by Veronica and Olivia at the upcoming business gala, explicitly detailing their behavior. It required the establishment of the Briggs Community Fund, financed by Crown Line, to support working-class families in Riverton. It demanded a full scholarship program for underprivileged engineering students named after my husband, George Briggs. And finally, it mandated the implementation of a strict internal policy against class-based discrimination, with an independent ombudsman to enforce it. Lawrence told me later that when Veronica read the terms in the boardroom at Hartwell Tower, she looked as though she had swallowed glass. She treated the proposal like a death sentence, a complete dismantling of the carefully manicured image she had spent decades building. But the other board members were not looking at image. They were looking at the bottom line. They saw a lifeline that would keep their stock options from becoming worthless, and they were terrified. They looked at Veronica not as a queen, but as a liability. Daniel was sitting at that table, attending his first meeting as an executive member. Lawrence described him as pale and sweating, caught in the crossfire. The board turned to him, their eyes demanding that he fix the mess his family had created. They told him to call his mother. They told him to use whatever emotional leverage he had left to get me to withdraw the humiliating terms. For the first time, Daniel was being asked to choose between his corporate survival and his mother's dignity, and the room was not letting him hide. Olivia, who had been invited to the meeting as a shareholder, tried to play her usual card. She insisted that they just needed to pressure me harder, claiming I was weak and would fold if they threatened to cut me off completely. That was when Marcus, following my instructions, sent a video file to the tablet of every board member present. It was the footage from the rehearsal dinner. The camera angle was perfect. It showed Olivia's face, twisted with malice, as she threw the wine. It captured the sound of the glass shattering and her voice sneering about my poverty. It showed Daniel standing by, doing nothing. The boardroom went dead silent. This was not just a family spat anymore. It was a public relations nuclear bomb. If that video leaked to the press or social media, Crown Line's reputation would be destroyed, and their stock would plummet beyond recovery. Olivia slumped in her chair, the arrogance draining out of her as she realized she was not the victim, but the villain on tape. Lawrence stood up at the end of the table. He told them they had exactly 72 hours to accept the deal in its entirety. He looked at Daniel and said that the only price that was not negotiable was the respect owed to the woman they had wronged. An hour later, my phone rang. It was Daniel. He was not calling to apologize. He was panicked, his voice cracking with fear. He told me I was ruining his life. He asked how I could humiliate him like this, how I could force his wife to beg for forgiveness in public. He said I was burning down everything he had worked for. I listened to him scream, feeling a strange sense of detachment. When he finally stopped to breathe, I answered him calmly. I told him that I was not ruining his life. I was simply refusing to let him ruin mine. I told him that he had started this process the moment he stood silent while his wife humiliated me. I told him that he had spent years running away from who he was, and now he had to stop running and start fixing. That night, I sat in my kitchen, listening to the silence of the house. I imagined Olivia in her penthouse, watching that video over and over again. I wondered if she finally saw what I saw, not a powerful woman putting a peasant in her place, but a bully attacking someone who could not fight back. I wondered if the shame was finally starting to creep in, past the anger and the entitlement. I looked at the clock on the wall. The second hand swept past the 12 with a rhythmic click. Tick, tock. The countdown had begun. 72 hours. It was not just a countdown for Crown Line. It was a countdown for my relationship with my son. The tension was pulled so tight it hummed in the air, and we were all just waiting for the snap. The 72 hours that followed were the longest of my life. Yet strangely, they were also the quietest. I did not pace the floors. I did not stare at the phone. Instead, I went out into the garden and pulled weeds. I sat on the porch with Lawrence, drinking Earl Grey tea and watching the clouds drift over the smokestacks of the factories down in the valley. I was practicing. I was teaching myself how to breathe in a world where the outcome did not depend on my silence. I prepared myself for the possibility that I might lose my son forever, and I realized that if that was the price of my dignity, I was finally willing to pay it. On the second day, Daniel came to the house. He did not bring flowers. He did not bring a bottle of wine or a forced smile. He looked exhausted. His tie loosened. Dark circles carved deep under his eyes. He stood in the doorway, looking less like a corporate executive and more like a lost child. "Do you really want Crown Line to collapse?" "Mom?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Do you want to see everything burned to the ground?" I opened the screen door and let him in. "I do not want the company to collapse, Daniel. I just want the truth to finally stand in its proper place." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he used to do his homework, while I balanced the checkbook. I told him something I had never spoken of before. I told him about my own mother, about how she hid Lawrence's letters because she thought a mechanic's son was not good enough for me. I told him how I had lived a life shaped by someone else's fear of what the neighbors might think. I let fear make my choices once, I told him. I lost the love of my life because I was afraid to question authority. I will not let fear decide the end of my life. Daniel. Not my fear. And certainly not yours. Daniel looked down at the grain of the wood table. For a long time, he did not speak. When he finally did, it was a confession that sounded like it was being torn out of his chest. I was ashamed, he whispered. When I went to college, when I met Olivia, I was ashamed of this house. I was ashamed of your coupons. I was ashamed that my father was an electrician. I thought if I just became one of them, if I erased where I came from, I would finally be safe. I let them treat you like that because every time they looked down on you, I was terrified they were actually looking at me. It was the most honest thing he had said to me in 20 years. I wanted to reach out and hug him, to tell him it was okay, but I stopped myself. Hugging him now would only comfort him, and he needed to feel this discomfort to change. I am not asking for your apology, Daniel, I said firmly. And I am not asking you to choose me over your wife. I am asking you to choose what is right. If you stand with me, do not do it because you are afraid of losing the company. Do it because you are tired of being a man who lets his wife throw wine at his mother. If you want to fix this, action comes first. Words come later. While we sat in my kitchen, the walls of the Hart Empire were shaking. Lawrence told me that the minority shareholders were in a panic. They viewed my demands as a moral cost of doing business, a price they were willing to pay to save their investments. Veronica, however, saw it as a death blow to her ego. She was frantically trying to liquidate personal assets, trying to raise enough capital to pay off the debt Lawrence held so she could tell me to go to hell. But it was too little, too late. She was thrashing in a net that had already closed. When the 72 hours were up, Daniel walked into the emergency board meeting at Hartwell Tower. Lawrence said he looked pale, his hands trembling slightly as he arranged his papers, but his eyes were clear. Veronica sat at the head of the table, expecting him to present a compromise, expecting him to be the dutiful son-in-law who smoothed things over. Instead, Daniel stood up. He looked at the board. Then he looked at Veronica. I vote to accept the restructuring proposal from Eleanor Briggs and Kane Rowe Holdings in its entirety, Daniel said, his voice ringing through the silent room. I accept the conditions regarding the community fund, and I accept the requirement for a public apology. If the board requires my resignation for my part in the events that led to this, you have it. But we are done hiding. Veronica looked as if she had been slapped. The air went out of the room. The other board members, sensing the shift in power, quickly moved to second the motion. The coup was over before she even realized she had lost. My phone rang an hour later. It was Marcus. It is done. Eleanor, he said. They signed. The apology will take place at the City Real Estate Gala next Friday. It is the same venue where the Harts usually hold court. Now, it will be where they make amends. I hung up the phone and placed my hand flat on the cool surface of the kitchen table. My fingers were trembling, not from fear, but from the release of a tension I had carried for decades. I looked out the window at the sun setting over the rooftops of Riverton. I felt lighter, as if a heavy winter coat had finally been lifted from my shoulders. I had won. But more importantly, My son had finally stopped running. The Sterling Crown Hotel ballroom was a cavern of gold leaf and velvet, the kind of place where the air conditioning smelled like vanilla and old money. Tonight, the entire real estate and financial elite of the city had gathered under the massive crystal chandeliers. Photographers were jostling for position near the stage, their flashbulbs popping like distant lightning. I walked in on Lawrence's arm. I was not wearing a designer gown this time. I was wearing a simple, deep navy blue dress that the daughter of my next-door neighbor had sewn for me. It fit perfectly, modest but elegant. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was walking into a room where I belonged. As we moved through the crowd, the atmosphere shifted. The same faces that had looked through me at the rehearsal dinner, regarding me as nothing more than a stain on the scenery, now turned to watch me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. I heard the whispers rippling through the room. They were calling me the woman who held the lifeline. They knew that with a single signature. I had brought the mighty Crown Line developments to its knees and then pulled it back up again. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the hall. He announced a special presentation. The room went quiet. Veronica Hart walked onto the stage. She looked impeccable as always, but her movements were stiff, like a marionette fighting its strings. She stood behind the podium and unfolded a piece of paper. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the strain in it as she read the apology that Marcus had approved. She admitted to the disrespect shown to me. She admitted to the toxic culture that had been allowed to fester within her family and her company. It was a lawyerly apology, precise and legally binding. But seeing Veronica Hart publicly humble herself was a sight that shifted the tectonic plates of the room. Then it was Olivia's turn. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Her hands were trembling as she took the microphone. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she did not look at the audience. She looked at her shoes. When she spoke, her voice was thin. She did not just apologize for the wine. She admitted why she had done it. She confessed that she was terrified her wealthy friends would find out Daniel came from a working-class family and would laugh at her. She admitted that she had tried to erase my existence to protect her own fragile vanity. It was a moment of raw, ugly truth that stripped away the glamour of the evening. The cameras zoomed in on me sitting in the front row. I did not smile. I did not cry. I kept my hands clasped in my lap, my face calm. I refused to be the gloating victor. I was simply a witness to the consequences of their actions. When the host invited me to the stage, the silence in the room was absolute. I walked up the steps, Lawrence giving me a small, encouraging nod. I stood at the podium and looked out the sea of expectant faces. I did not need a piece of paper. I spoke about the night my son called me selfish. I spoke about the feeling of being slowly pushed away from the table of my own life, of being told that my value had expired because my bank account was small. I looked directly at Daniel, who was sitting in the front row with his head bowed. I told the room that I had to learn how to respect myself all over again. I took a breath and delivered the words that had been burning in my chest for a week. "Money can buy you a seat in the front row of this room," I said, my voice carrying to the back of the hall. "But it cannot buy you the right to trample on the person who sat up all night sewing the hem of your first shirt." I paused, letting the words settle. Then I announced the creation of the Briggs Community Fund and the George Briggs Scholarship for engineering students. I explained that Crown Line would be funding these initiatives as part of their restructuring. "If there is anything to be proud of tonight," I concluded, It is that a terrible mistake has been forced to become a great good for those who actually need it. There was a beat of silence, and then applause broke out. It was not the raucous, polite applause of a party. It was respectful, grounded, and sincere. As I walked down the stairs, Daniel stood up. He did not look around to see who was watching. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in my shoulder. It was not a performance for the cameras. It was the embrace of a man who had walked to the edge of the cliff, looked down, and realized just how close he had come to losing the only unconditional love he would ever know. The morning after the gala, Daniel came to my house alone. He was not wearing a suit or a tie, just a plain button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking more like the boy I raised than the executive he had become. His eyes were red and swollen. He did not bring a peace offering. He did not bring excuses. He sat on my worn sofa, put his head in his hands, and apologized. For the first time, he did not say that he was stressed or that Olivia made him do it. He simply admitted that he had failed me and that he understood if I was not ready to forgive him yet. I listened to him, feeling the quiet shift in the room. I did not offer him immediate absolution. Instead, I set boundaries. I told him that if he wanted to rebuild our relationship, it would happen on my terms. No more sitting at the back of the room. No more phone calls that started with him telling me how busy he was. If he wanted me in his life, I had to be a priority, not an obligation. When he asked about Olivia, I gave him a message for her. I told him that I was willing to meet her, but only when she was ready to speak to me as a woman, not as a negotiator trying to secure a treaty for her family company. She needed to come to this house, sit on this couch, and look me in the eye without a lawyer or a checkbook in her hand. Later that afternoon, I received an email from Marcus. It was the confirmation that the Briggs Community Fund and the George Briggs Scholarship had officially begun distributing aid. Attached were photographs of construction workers wearing safety vests with the new fund logo, holding checks and smiling. There were families receiving grants for heating bills and tuition. I looked at the screen and felt a lump in my throat. The humiliation I had suffered had been transmuted into warmth and safety for people who actually needed it. It was the only apology that truly mattered. Lawrence arrived a few hours later to take me to the new Cane Row building. He led me to a bright, sunlit space on the ground floor that smelled of fresh paint and new paper. Above the entrance, a plaque read, "The Briggs Reading Corner." He told me that he did not just want my name on the wall. He wanted me to run it. He wanted me to curate the books and organize reading sessions for seniors and workers. He was giving me the chance to be a benefactor, to be a person who gave rather than a person who needed to be saved. We walked down to the edge of the Riverton River afterwards, watching the water move slowly toward the south. The wind was cool, but the sun was warm on my face. Lawrence turned to me and asked a question that stopped me in my tracks. He asked me how I would live my life if I were no longer afraid of being alone. It was a question that opened a door I had kept locked for decades. My life had been a series of waiting rooms, waiting for Daniel to call, waiting to be invited, waiting to be noticed. I realized that I did not have to wait anymore. I told Lawrence that I wanted to take a soft skills course at the community center to learn how to manage the reading corner properly. I told him I wanted to finally go see the ocean, to visit that small beach town I had only ever seen in magazines, but never dared to spend the money to visit. I told him I wanted to supervise the fund named after my husband to honor his memory without being trapped by the past. That night, I sat alone in my house. I looked around at the chipped paint and the wobbly chair and the photos of George and Daniel laughing. For years, I had seen this house as a burden, a symbol of what I lacked. Now, I saw it for what it was. It was not just an asset to be leveraged. It was a witness. It was the place where I had loved, grieved, and survived. I walked to the hallway mirror and looked at my reflection. I saw an old woman with silver hair, but the fear was gone from her eyes. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Lawrence saying he would come over tomorrow with the blueprints for the reading corner and a roadmap because we had a lot of places to go. I turned off the ringer and leaned back in my chair, a small smile playing on my lips. They had tried to push me out of the seat of my own life, but in the end, I was the one who decided where I sat. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let us get a conversation started. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button so we can share this message with even more people.